Hey there everybody, thank you for joining in my presentation. I'm not going to focus much on the ontological or the philosophical notions of time, as I feel that they're outside of the scope of a 10-minute presentation or a 10 to 15 page paper. Instead, I'm going to focus on neural correlates of consciousness, processes that we can measure, that we can correlate with subjective experiences of time. I do this through the lens of transient hypofrontality, looking at thermodynamic processes and electromagnetic interactions that we can infer in the theory of transient hypofrontality, how we can tie that back to Prigoghine's dissipative structures and recursive structures, and then finally we can speculate, or how we can speculate, a connection to the changes in the subjective experiences of time. So from transient hypofrontality to Prigoghine's dissipative structures, and then tying that back into the subjective experiences of time. The first things first though, what is transient hypofrontality and why is it relevant to our discussion? Transient hypofrontality is a theory of cognitive science that essentially rests on two assumptions. The first assumption, A, is that the brain has limited resources and brain structures, systems, and areas compete for those resources, and the main resource being blood, how much blood is available to the brain and to those structures. And B, that the subjective experience of consciousness is a process. Now the second one, right, that the subjective experience of consciousness is a process, is something that we're going to then speculate off of later on when it comes to the dissipative structures and the subjective experiences of time that emerge from those dissipative structures that we can then analyze in the theory of transient hypofrontality. But the first part, A, is what we got to look at first, right? The brain having limited resourcing of blood, right? We got to look at the prefrontal cortex, because the frontality in transient hypofrontality has to do with blood going to the prefrontal cortex. There's a lot of experimental evidence that show that our normal conscious interactions are such that the prefrontal cortex has a steady or constant supply of blood. When that blood flow changes, right, we can ask patients what they're experiencing. They could say that they're having an altered state of consciousness, a different subjective experience of time, and then we could measure that there's less blood in the prefrontal cortex. So there is a correlation between the amount of blood in the prefrontal cortex and our subjective experience of self, of identity, itself, of time, and of community. But for our conversation, we're really focused on the subjective experience of time. So that was kind of the birth of transient hypofrontality, was born out of those experiments that measured a change in blood flow to the prefrontal cortex can be correlated to a change in subjective experience of time and self. Okay, so where that led me to is, well, what is it about blood that would allow, like, what are the physical processes carried by blood or induced by blood that may affect the subjective experience of time within the brain? And how can we tie that into Prigoghine's work of dissipative structures? In order to really understand the role of electromagnetism and thermodynamics in the blood, we really got to understand the role in the heart. So that's where my research began in transient hypofrontality. It's understanding the role of electromagnetism in the heart. And the heart is like a beautiful electromagnetic inducer, right? For example, myocardial depolarization is a process by which the heart beats, and it all has to do with the exchanging of electromagnetic potential. We can see that red blood cells, right, which carry hemoglobin, which carry the oxygen through the arteries to the cell and then back into the lungs and the heart to then get reoxygenated, that the red blood cells themselves respond to mechanical waves, like acoustic waves, and respond to electromagnetic waves. They have charged ions on their membrane that fluctuate from mechanical waves, inducing a change in electromagnetic potential. And the change in electromagnetic potential can then move membranes, which then cause mechanical stress, which then cause electromagnetic interactions. So you get this amazing feedback loop of electromagnetic energy and mechanical energy in the red blood cells. And we could speculate that areas, especially of the brain, that have more of this activity going on may be producing more heat, may be producing and regulating entropy in new and interesting ways that we can tie into our speculations with Prigoghine's work. Okay, from electroacoustic waves to ultrasound waves, the reflection and refraction of mechanical waves induce changes in electromagnetic potential in areas where there are red blood cells, especially oxygenated red blood cells. And we know that the brain, and we can show that the brain is getting a constant supply of oxygenated blood, which is really important, right? Because oxygen is negatively charged, right? Has a greater electromagnetic potential than other elements or other non-ionized elements. So that becomes really important in understanding the connection between thermodynamic processes, the exchange of kinetic energy and heat, to electromagnetic processes, right? The exchanging of electromagnetic potentials across gradients in the blood, in red blood cells, which are then carried into capillaries and out of capillaries to kind of fuel the cells. Okay, where this gets to in the brain is speculations on entropy. Right? Because if we can speculate that there are there's more blood in areas of the brain in the prefrontal cortex, we can speculate that there's a change in the amount of heat being generated, the amount of electromagnetic potential across those areas of the brain, and then we can calculate rates of entropy. It doesn't correlate to an exact, like, intuitive one-to-one ratio, where we would think if there was, for example, more blood would mean more electromagnetic interactions, which would mean more mechanical stress, which would mean more heat, which would mean more entropy being generated, which would mean more complexity. This, what I'm calling like a one-to-one, like an intuitive correlation, is not exactly how it goes down. It's a little bit more nuanced than that. There's still entropy being generated when there's not blood flow to those parts of the brain. It's just not as regulated. It's not as controlled within a structured system. And this is where the idea of dissipative structures really becomes illuminating in that sense. To say that there's a change in entropy production. It's not that there's necessarily more or less. There may be, and we can make that argument in certain cases. But it's more so that there's a change in the regulation of entropy production. Right? One of my ideas going into this, which was inspired by Kerry's comment on my proposal, was that if we look in like that example that I had just laid out, where we have more blood in the prefrontal cortex, more electromagnetic interactions, more entropy, more complexity, there may be this heightened sense of individuality, right? This kind of like this unified process of the individual, like demarking this clear boundary between the dissipative structure in the brain and the environment, right? We feel more like an individual when we have blood flowing to our prefrontal cortex. Could that be related in some senses to entropy production, to dissipative structures? I think it has to do with, and I'm going to make an argument, that it has to do with or can be correlated to the formation of a dissipative structure within the prefrontal cortex, and even sharing interactions with other parts of the brain, that we kind of get this like fixed structure of electromagnetic interactions and thermodynamic potentials exchanged within those parts of the brain, which can be argued for as like defining like this clear boundary between the dissipative structure, the individual process, and the process of the environment, right? So we feel more like an individual separate from our environment when we have more blood to our prefrontal cortex. We can also speculate kind of like the opposite, right? Where when we have less blood in the prefrontal cortex, we have less heat being generated, less electromagnetic interactions, less entropy, and less complexity. Therefore, we have a reduction in the sense of individuality, right? Less of a dissipative structure in the prefrontal cortex, which allows for perhaps more of a connection to the experience in our surroundings, right? We then kind of get enveloped in the dissipative structures around us rather than being enveloped within the dissipative structures going on within our prefrontal cortex. And I say that this concept of dissipative structures formed by the electromagnetic potential and the thermodynamic processes in the brain, even though it's not a clear one-to-one ratio between more blood, more entropy, or less blood, less entropy, that there is a correlation between a change in the subjective experience of time, and that the passage of time itself can feel more dense when there is more blood in the prefrontal cortex, and that the subjective experience of time can feel less dense, right, can pass in different ways to our perception when there's less blood flow to the prefrontal cortex. So that's where most of my research has centered on. I really look forward to sharing the paper because I was able to dive into these concepts really well, connecting transient hypofrontality, thermodynamic interactions, electromagnetic interactions to Prigoghine's concepts of dissipative structures, looking at how dissipative structures can form within networks in the brain, how blood flow affects entropy production and the formation of those dissipative structures, and then finally how that affects our subjective experience of time. And looking at it through the sense of altered states of consciousness, looking at evidence presented from altered states of consciousness, both that are drug-induced, pain-induced, trauma-induced, meditative-induced, even in like flow state athletes and artists that are in flow states, we can measure changes in the direction or the regulation of blood within the brain. So I hope my arguments come off as coherent, and I look forward to hearing what everybody thinks and watching everybody else's presentations. Appreciate you guys being here for the full 10 minutes, and we'll speak soon. Thank you.